Thank you so much for your attention. I know that this is a little bit different this year. So introductions. Hi folks, I'm Seth. I'll be your co-trainer for today. I'm a partner success specialist with Action Builder and Action Network, which are our digital tool sets that work specifically in the progressive movement. I have a background in advocacy and community organizing. I started very young as a community organizer here in Cleveland, Ohio, where I'm based. In recent years, I've shifted to focus more on movement technology and IT. So prior to joining Action Network, I led IT workforce training for the largest community college in the state of Ohio. And that was really rewarding. Once I had the opportunity to come back into movement work, I loved the opportunity to be able to combine those two passions that I have as around as training folks and then doing progressive movement work. So I've had the pleasure of working with my Action Builder teammates and then also our partners at the AFL-CIO for almost 2 years now. And if you haven't heard about Action Builder, it is a newish digital tool set from the makers of Action Network. And it's built to facilitate one-on-one organizing. And we'll define more of that in this training today. It helps organizers develop deep relationships, track campaign support, and empowers activists to make a difference in their workplace and community. So I'm excited to be a co-lead for this training with Liz Riley, who will introduce herself and share how she got started as an organizer. Liz?
Hey, thanks, Seth. So I am Liz Riley. My title is Organizing Data Strategist over at the AFL-CIO, but I am an organizer, a labor organizer for the last 10 years. I'm really grateful and honored that Seth asked me to help co-train and to be here with all of you at Netroots Nation amongst such inspiring organizers and power builders. As I said, I've been in labor organizing for 10 years, and I started out at SEIU Healthcare Michigan, organizing home care workers. And I think of this time as my guerrilla organizing years because it was very scrappy, it was very creative, rooted in field work. And the focus was around earned media actions, particularly around right to work and Medicaid expansion in Michigan. Our targets were politicians and our victories mostly legislative. It felt a lot like the community organizing a lot of us engage in. But then I moved after Netroots in Detroit, actually, to the Michigan Nurses Association. And this is where it was really conventional tactical organizing. This is where I learned the fundamentals of good labor organizing that we'll go over today. It was tactical, methodical. We talked about the math and the music, or I learned, deepened the math and the music of organizing. So it was really strategic decisions rooted in data. There was, of course, room for dancing, but it was very targeted. We had a clear victory. We had our clear numbers of people we were organizing, and that victory was an NLRB election where we would form a union and then win a contract. And our targets were often bosses, but more importantly, the union busters behind the bosses that ran that anti-union campaign. So I'm really excited to be here with you all today.
So just wanted to set a few ground rules as we get into this training. So we will be interacting. We see folks posting in the chat box, which is great. We want to know who's all in the room, and we want folks to be able to have that interaction and engagement. If you do have a question, we will be pausing to take questions at natural points in the conversation. There's two functionalities in Zoom I'm sure folks are familiar with at this point. There is the chat, which will have ongoing dialogue, but it'll be much easier for Liz and myself to field questions. If you have specific questions, please use the Q&A chat feature so we can kind of answer, and then I'll be fielding that as we go along. Next is we're going to be participating in the spirit of learning, and we want to affirm folks' lived experiences and knowledge that is extremely valuable. Lived experiences make people an expert as it relates to their lives and their communities. So we all come to this training together in affirming that everyone here is a teacher and a student, and we're going to be learning a great deal from each other and with each other today. So really excited to have you, and thank you for making time to do this. So I wanted to be able to set the framework for today. I want to share an excerpt from the forthcoming Action Builder Guide to Building a Strong, Resilient, Leader-Led Organizing Program. This section is called What We Know as Organizers. So it's no secret that organizing is hard work. At the same time, talking with people, knowing them, creating relationships, and building leaders is what has and will advance our progressive movement. Plus, it's what sustains us, protects our most vulnerable, and for many of us, it's what brings us joy. We know that building authentic relationships with and between people is the best way to help people shift their view of themselves relative to their work and community. Real relationships also allow organizers to best identify leaders, which helps win, propel, and sustain progressive policies and ideals. We know that much of the work of organizing is about building robust networks based on trust and knowing that we have each other's backs. It's about seeing, knowing, and honoring our humanity and the rights that come with it. Now, we haven't discovered any new models, methods, or tactics. We've learned from and continue to learn from people who work tirelessly day in and day out to help folks recognize and step into their individual and collective power. We know that our challenge is learning how to integrate voting and organizing, moments and movements, winning and wielding power, local resources and national resources, high tech and high touch, mobilizing folks and building leaders, C3 and C4, and practicing passion and patience. These are not easy accomplishments, but now is our time to figure out how to unite these actions for impact. Together we can and will create the future we've envisioned all along. So in this training, we will draw from labor organizing tactics and translate it to a broader organizing campaign to build power for the people. So the causes or campaigns led by a committed volunteers, identified, trained, and sustained by a core group of organizers is what really all these core concepts that we're going to talk about really hinge on. So the 5 core concepts that we'll cover today. Liz, did you want to take this one?
Sure. So we'll talk about what an assessment is, some examples, what's a one-on-one conversation, how to identify and nurture leaders, how to assign tasks strategically, and how to measure progress and define wins.
And before we dig into each of these concepts, we want to do a short poll. So what we'll do is we're going to, again, have you participate in the chat box and answer first. Question 1, I'm putting it in the chat box. Of these 5 learning points, which do you have experience with? So of these 5 points, you can just answer with either A, assessment, B, what is a one-on-one, C, how to identify and nurture leaders, D, how to assign tasks, E, how to measure progress and define wins, and F, none of the above. Cool, thank you for these responses. You see any?
Some great experience in the room.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa. First half of E. Okay, moving on to Q2. Of these 5 learning points, which do you have the most interest in learning about? This will really help us to structure today's training. So, of these 5 learning points, which do you have the most interest in learning about? A, what is assessment? B, what is a one-on-one? C, how to identify and nurture leaders. D, how to assign tasks. E, how to measure progress and define wins. Or F, all of the above. Okay.
A lot of interest in defining wins and progress, as well as assessments. Those 2 are linked, so that's great.
Thanks for folks for participating. So it looks like we have a strong interest in, again, learning about assessments and measuring those, measuring progress and defining wins. So I know Liz knows all about that. So speaking of Liz, Liz, take it away.
Thanks, Seth. So as we go through these 5 learning points, I want to talk to you about a campaign that I was involved in. It was really my pride and joy at Huron Valley Hospital. And the reason I want to reference back to this campaign is because it's a classic example on a labor organizing campaign. It touches on and was driven on all 5 of these learning points that we're going to cover today. And so just a little framework, Huron Valley was part of the Detroit Medical Center healthcare group, which used to be a nonprofit organization and was really the pride of the community, an anchor of the community. Everyone in the Detroit area would know someone who was born there, died, their lives of their family members had been saved there. And as a nonprofit, it did a lot of work in the community. But a few years ago, a for-profit corporation, multinational corporation, Tenet Healthcare, boo hiss, put it in the chat, bought DMC Healthcare Medical Center, and the culture changed dramatically. And so 2 nurses in the emergency room, Anne and Kathy, saw that patient care was decreasing. They were in a lot of pain, their patients were in pain, and they had to do something about it. So they called Michigan Nurses Association, and I was lucky enough to work with them. It was about 350 nurses, none of whom knew anything about organizing. They just knew that what was happening in their community was wrong and they couldn't live with it anymore. And through their campaign, they gained so much power and strength that Tenet Corporation actually sent in Frank Canonica, who was the in-house union buster from their corporate headquarters in Dallas, Texas, to come in and fight the nurses, run an anti-union campaign. Look him up on LinkedIn. He lists labor avoidance as his specialty. And so I want to tell you how these nurses fought and won that campaign.
Thanks, Liz. All right, so let's get into learning. Number 1, what is an assessment? So assessments are essential components to building the collective power of volunteers and activists as workplace and community experts who recognize their power and lead their own work in their own communities. How would you use this in your organizing? It really is another tool that's in your toolbox. It gives you a quick glimpse of where someone stands in relation to their leadership growth and their engagement with your organization or issue. So in this, in the image examples here, we have Ask Me, their assessment system which they've shared is a 1 through 4 scale, with 4 being not supporting, 1 being a committee member, and then the 2s and 3s, 2 being solid union supporter, and 3 undecided or movable. The next image here was actually a screenshot from the Action Builder tool, which is assessments are core to. So that gives you the opportunity to translate your assessment that you might have in your organization into the system itself. And you can set that up 1 through 4 as an Ask Me example, or 1 through 6, what have you. So Liz, have you used assessments in your work, and could you share how you use them?
Yeah, I mean, not only have I used assessments, I would say this is the core tool that I use for all of my organizing campaigns. In labor, we use a pretty standard assessment 1 through 4. It can go up through 1 through 6. But generally, and this can be translated to community organizing, your 1s are your leaders. So I'm curious if you want to put in the chat, if I asked you to define what a leader is, what would you say? What would you call a leader? So go ahead and throw that in the chat and I'll come back to it. Because there's a nurse, Judy, who was just such a powerful leader in this organization. She was loved and respected by everybody. She was the nurse of the year. When I would go to random nurse Betty and say, will you sign this petition? That nurse would say no, but if Judy asked, that nurse says yes, and what more can I do, Betty? Judy. So curious, the core, we have a lot of traits we attribute to leaders, but the reality is it's very simple. A leader has followers. That's all it boils down to. That's the difference between your leaders, your 1s, and your supporters, your 2s. So the other group is your 2s, your supporters, and these are the people who follow the leaders. They're the people who, like another nurse in OB, Amy. She was a new nurse, she was a millennial, she was passionate and socially conscious, but she had a newborn and not a lot of extra time outside of work. She would take part in our activities, our actions. She was pro-union. She would support what we did, but she didn't have the time to organize or lead her colleagues. Also, she was just not very well known outside of her small group of friends at work. So she was a solid 2. Then you have your 3s. And I think 3s, probably the most important assessment, but often overlooked. Your 3s are your undecided people. And the reason I say it's the most important is because campaigns are won and lost based on your 3s. And our job in a campaign is to use all these tactics that are going to follow to move our 3s up to 2s and ideally up to 1s, right? So those are the people who are like, you just asked, are you pro-union? Do you care about whatever issue you're working on? And they say, I'm not sure, maybe, sort of, you know, kind of hem and haw. That's a 3. Versus a supporter who says, yeah, sure, of course. Or a leader who says, yes, and what can I do, right? And then you have your 4s. Your 4s would be your anti-people. So anti-union, anti-your issue. And the 4s, I think a trap that we often fall into is we really want to convince our antis to join us, right? We want to organize the world. But when you've identified someone as a 4, thank you, I respect you, you're entitled to your opinion, I respect you, have a nice life, right? We don't want to waste time trying to organize our 4s if they're just going to be anti the whole time. We would rather put that energy into talking to our people we haven't talked to before, our unassessed folks, or our 3s, 2s, and 1s. And just kind of as an asterisk, you know, in labor, there's 5s and 6s, active anti-union who are working with the union busters. I also like sometimes to use 2+ and 2- because the tasks and the one-on-ones you have with a strong 2 versus a weak 2 are a little bit different. So you can get into that nuance if you want to, but just know that your 2- are actually 3s. And the one last note, our enemies, our union busters, are assessing people as well. So we've got folks that we're fighting against. They are assessing all of the individuals in our campaign as well. And they're doing the same thing. They're just trying to build their team of 4s.
Right, right. So that's how you know that it's a tactic that works if your enemies are using it. So thank you, Liz. So now we've defined what an assessment is. Let's move. So number 2, what is a one-on-one? So what we know is organizing conversations are powerful because they allow us to cultivate an authentic bond of trust in knowing that we have shared interests. So by taking time to listen, ask questions, and know the problems and possible solutions our neighbors and coworkers have, we uncover our commonalities. So we realize that together we can stomp out any issue that is harming us and that we can have each other's back along that fight. So you can really think about organizing conversations kind of like a friendly interview. So what does that mean in action? So the one-on-one is, again, a tactic, it's an organizing tactic where you meet with people individually. So the goal is really to listen and listen well, and this is a skill that you can kind of develop over time as an organizer, to draw out their perspectives, especially on topics that they care deeply about. And you want to empower them to take action to change it, and this is often called agitation. So Liz, I think you might know a little bit about this.
Yes, I have had thousands of one-on-one conversations in the last 10, I'm not exaggerating, even in the first few years of home care organizing, just thousands of these conversations. And I think the big pitfall that we, and even I, after 6 years of organizing and all this experience, fall into this pitfall is I go into a conversation and I'm trying to recruit someone, or I'm trying to convince them to join the union. And that is not what a one-on-one conversation is about. For example, in the Huron Valley campaign, we were close to an election, but we've never broken into the OB department, babies department, right? And so a few weeks before the election, we had this coffee meeting, a one-on-one with the nurse Janet. And I was so excited, and my organizing committee was so excited, and we're like, we really, really need this to get into the department. And so I did a lot of the talking, and not a lot of asking questions, not a lot of listening, not a lot of trying to understand their issues and what they cared about, so that I could then, you know, agitate and help them to come to an answer on their own. I was trying to recruit, and I never saw Janet again, and we never got into the OB department. But that is countered by my conversation with Chrissy, who was a nurse on the med-surg unit, And Christy's political leanings were about as far as they could be from me. She was pretty right-wing, borderline libertarian. She didn't want to send her kids to public school. She drives a pickup truck, but she was a nurse and she cares deeply for her patients and for her coworkers. So first of all, I had to shed any preconceived notions I had about who this person is and come in with kind of an open mind. I met her for coffee and asked her about herself, about her work, her life, her struggles. She told me that, you know, she used to care for 3 or 4 patients at a time, which kept her busy, but at least allowed her to give each patient that quality care that they deserved. But now Tenet was making her care for 4, 5, 6, sometimes, God forbid, 7 patients every shift. And she would go home at night fearing for their safety, wondering if she could have done more, worried that there was something that she missed because she just didn't have the time. So what I did in that one-on-one is just listen to her story intensely and ask the right conversations, right questions at the right moments. What's a typical day look like for you? What do you like the most about your job? If you could, what would you change? Why isn't it like that now? Who makes those decisions? Who benefits from those decisions? Why? Her story came pouring out like an avalanche until she actually moved herself to tears. I barely said anything and spoke not more than 20% of the time. And this is a key. If you've ever heard of the 80-20 rule, your person you're talking to speaks 80% of the time, you speak 20% of the time. And when you do speak, try and make it as questions, right? I didn't even talk about the union until the very end. After over an hour of talking and crying, and after she told me, yes, I'm willing to take action to make a difference. In that conversation, she was the one that convinced herself that she needed to do something and that forming the union was the thing to do.
Wow. So Liz, it sounds like you're really able to draw out from herself through your questioning and help her to make a realization, which again, it involves a lot of listening. And sometimes folks do need to be questioned. They do need to have agitation in order to rouse and bring up those emotions and thoughts, so they can truly question, you know, their day-to-day. It's kind of like realization through inquiry. Cool. So let's move on to number 3. How to identify and nurture leaders. So this is really, really important as we talk about this model, which is a leaderful model. Again, this helps to build sustainability with our movements by recognizing and cultivating our leaders through nurturing them. So what is it by definition? So leaders are folks people follow. So Liz kind of already spoke to this. The leader has the ability to influence a group of people towards an achievement or a goal. And I want to point out that the path to leadership is not necessarily a linear one. You kind of want to throw out, toss out the idea of what conventional leadership looks like in your mind from like kind of thinking about the corporate world. That's not what we're talking about here. There's not a linear path. There's not a particular look to a leader. It's simply someone that folks follow. So a volunteer might take on several different roles before they identify their own strength as a leader. So we really want to be able to define what leadership looks like within your organization, so that you can spot potential leaders and you can match volunteers to activities that lean into their strengths. So whether it looks like doing phone calls or tabling, everyone has their own unique strengths and where they stand in their leadership and have that opportunity to grow as leaders. So Liz, how do you identify and nurture leaders in your work?
Yeah, this is the key role and job of an organizer, is to identify the leaders. And we have to keep in mind that our workplaces, our communities are already organized. It is our job as organizers to identify those natural leaders that already exist and have one-on-ones to build relationships with them. So a couple more examples from here on Valley. Amy W. was a young ICU nurse who were having trouble talking to young nurses. And it turns out that she would host a bachelor watch party every week at her home with a lot of the other young nurses at the hospital. So, of course, when Amy joined the organizing committee, all of those young nurses were on our team too. I want to talk again about Judy, because Judy was a really core leader in our campaign. And the campaign did not start with her. at all. It was with two other leaders, Kathy and Ann in the ER. And how did I find Judy? By working with Kathy and Ann. So I asked those two nurses who had already stepped up questions like, who's the best nurse in the hospital? Who's the most respected? If you've got a problem, who do you go to? You know, if they said, let's go out for beers, everyone would come. Who is that nurse, right? And so Anne, who is, you know, probably one of the most underrated labor leaders in the country, in my opinion. But she's, you know, she's not extroverted. She's timid and quiet, but just a really strong person. And so she just saw Judy in the parking lot and said, I'm going to walk up and talk to her. And she told me later that she was shaking like a leaf. She didn't know Judy. She was near by reputation because Judy's the natural leader, right? And Anne just talked to her, invited her to a meeting at her home. You know, at that meeting of no more than 8 or 10 nurses, we didn't, again, try to recruit them. We were just talking about our stories, our issues, what we saw the solution to be. And Judy sat quiet as a mouse, just taking it all in. We didn't ask anyone to sign a union card. We didn't try to recruit. Again, like I said, we just listened and shared a vision, right? And then Judy went home. A week later, she went into work at the ICU and had a particularly terrible day. Tenant gave her 4 patients in the ICU when a manageable caseload is 2. So she pulled her best friend, Wendy, another natural leader in the hospital, literally into a closet and broke down and said, this is terrible, tenant's the worst, and we're forming a union and we have to do it, you know? And I met Judy and Wendy for coffee a few days later, and it broke open the entire campaign for us. I do want to mention that there are natural leaders that will not join your campaign, that will be fours as well. And union busters and our enemies will try to harness the power of those natural leaders for their ends as well.
Cool, thank you, Liz. I see we have a question in the question box. However, I'm not able to see it for whatever reason now. I'll get to that person, I promise you, since I figure it out. But yeah, let's go on to number 4. Because I know this, unlike my conventional Zoom meetings, we're not able to come off mute at this point, but I promise we'll get into the questions. So number 4 is how to assign tasks. So I learned this actually from Liz. I was kind of struggling with kind of thinking out how to define this, but tasks are like tests. So leaders and potential leaders should be active, public supporters of the campaign that you're working on. So we talked a little bit about natural leaders, but how do you cultivate those leaders? It is by organizers assigning tasks and looking at their volunteers and the folks that they're working to organize and understanding them well enough to work with them to assign the appropriate tasks to help them to grow in their leadership development. So it's a growth tactic. Leaders and potential leaders should be active and public supporters, like I said, so they should be willing to speak in public. And you need to define what the leadership means when you launch a campaign. This is crucial so that the leadership feels like it's earned and it's not just a title. So kind of dovetailing into number 3 on how to identify and nurture leaders, Liz, how do you assign tasks, and why do you assign tasks?
Yeah, so I have a lot to say about tasks, and tasks are really designed to escalate your campaign, to test your leaders. They can also be used to grow leaders. You know, like I said last time, our job is to identify the natural leaders, but it can't be ignored that we can grow leaders as well through a campaign. But also to test your supporters, and as we'll test our success, right? So I want to talk a little bit about calling downs, and this might get to the question in the chat about how we can do it now when we can't see people's faces. But calling downs was a nurse in the OR, and we were struggling to organize the OR. The first time we spoke was by phone, and she was so scared that she couldn't even get a word out. I mean, literally, I was on the phone with her, and she was just stammering out vowels like like that, you know. And a year later, after slowly completing these escalating tasks, she went from, will you talk to this organizer on the phone, to, will you come to this meeting, to, will you sign this petition? And then a year later, will you appear on a television commercial publicly shaming your employer for their treatment of patients? So it was just this transformation. You can use tasks to move someone from a shaky feather to a steel hammer. And honestly, that is one of the most rewarding parts of running a campaign, is watching these activists, these leaders walk through the fires of a campaign and come out strong as steel on the other side. So a few concrete ways to answer this question. Tasks you want to escalate, right? So start small and build slowly with a clear goal at the end and clear connection to how each of these asks builds to the goal. So our goal was to win an election, an NLRB election, and to get a contract. But we did that by meeting for coffee, asking people to attend a small house meeting, asking someone to talk to a coworker. And then next question would be, or task would be, bring this coworker to a meeting. So you can see how they start small and escalate. Then the next might be, ask these 10 particular people to sign a petition in 3 days, right? Time frame. So that quantifiable stuff is very helpful as well. Not just get as many signatures as you can. No, you need to ask these 10 people by Friday to sign this petition, right? And then escalating from there, go back to those same 10 people and ask them to be a part of a delegation to deliver the petition. So you see how it builds. It all connects to a larger goal. And we're slowly moving people out of their comfort zones. So Colleen was terrified just to talk to me on the phone. But by escalating asks of her, I moved her from a terrified nurse, and it really wasn't me, it was her, right? But I asked her to do these things, and she found the courage inside herself to step slowly out of her comfort zone to become the leader that she is now. So just to wrap up, escalating, moving people outside of their comfort zones. Another important aspect is that tasks should build public support. So asking someone for a quote, but they won't sign their name to it, is completely worthless. You know, asking them for a quote to sign their name and add a picture, then they have skin in the game, then they're committed, then they're an actual supporter, not just telling you what you want to hear. They're an actual too that way, right? And then tasks should also get workers and activists, leaders talking to each other and fighting arm in arm, bonding them in solidarity.
Thanks, Liz. I know that we did talk about the aspect of fear, which is really real with regard to folks recognizing their power. And this is connected to the whole idea of agitation and the emotions that comes out of that discovery process. So you gave the example of the nurse that went from being so fearful that she could barely talk on the phone to becoming a strong organizer and a believer in the field. So just want to be very cognizant of that, especially we've got questions about how we do that today in light of our global pandemic, and that's something that I've been thinking about, and I'm sure you've been thinking about over the past several months. But I was hoping maybe you could speak a bit to that. And I promise folks, I see these questions coming up. We will get to those time willing, but I really want to make time to speak to the truth of the real fear and then the real emotions that come with folks recognizing their power and deciding to join up to create more power.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are some of the questions in the chat about how to have a one-on-one when you have to do it by phone and can't see their faces. Of course, face-to-face is always the most powerful, but I've had a lot of good over the phone one-on-one conversations. I've had Zoom face-to-face over Zoom can be quite effective. We see a lot of labor organizing campaigns using that to success. Always best to do in person, right? Like if you can move someone, I hesitate to recommend this, but if you move someone to the point where they're willing to have a masked, socially distanced in-person one-on-one with you, then that's really getting skin in the game, right? That's really moving out of comfort zones. But digitally, we can as well. But more importantly, and I think this is getting to the second question of tips for recruiting remote workplaces, cold calling feeling very risky. We don't have to do all the organizing. We just have to get like one or two to start, Anne and Kathy to start. If there's one or two people reaching out to you to start this, let them do the work. Let them have the one-on-one conversations. You can train them, you can help them gain these skills, but really it's about their relationships and their trust in each other in the workplace that makes the campaign. It's not, of course, as an organizer, people are going to have to trust trust you. But I had the deep relationships with my organizing committee. They had the relationships with it too, right? So they can be having these conversations on the phone much easier than you doing a cold call. And maybe their ask is, are you willing to talk to my organizer friend, right? And kind of move them up the ladder that way.
Thanks, Liz. So let's get into number 5 so that we can have some time for some questions. So number 5 is how to measure progress and define wins. So engaging leaders, activists, and members in defining what a win will be and how to measure progress towards the goal is a core part of this model and defining small wins along the way. I got to listen to the keynote from the first night of Netroots Nation, and I know Stacey Abrams, who I think is just phenomenal, but she did speak to this as far as, this is a marathon and we are in a war, and how do we define these smaller wins along the way, so that we do have sustainability, we have folks feeling like they're engaged and that they are understanding kind of like the long game, and have these milestones that really keep folks focused, and have times to be able to celebrate those wins. So how do we measure this progress? How do we track this progress? This speaks a little bit to the type of tools that we use, whether it's good old-fashioned paper and pencil, wall charts, Excel, tools like Action Builder, what have you. But how are we measuring this progress and defining these wins? These are really important for thinking about sustainability, and how we're tracking and measuring our progress. Are we doing the right things? Are we talking to the right folks? Are we having the right conversations? Are we asking the right questions? We need to have this ability to understand and reflect upon our progress. So with number 5, kind of wrapping up our core learning objectives today, Liz, please share your experience.
Yes, so I think my experience with the guerrilla organizing with home care workers is we just had thousands and thousands of home care workers. And I think this is common in community organizing as well. In labor organizing, it's a little easier. You have to define the scope of your campaign, right? In labor organizing, it's clear because there's so many workers who work for a particular employer and they're eligible to vote. And it's very important to know that I have 352 nurses, not 350-ish, 375-ish, because a lot of campaigns can be won and lost on 2 or 3 votes, right? So that's where the assessments come into play, where if I know and have assessed everyone in my campaign, I've defined the scope, this number of people, then I can be very effective. But in like the guerrilla organizing, I want to organize the world. I want to organize and talk to every single home care worker that exists in Michigan. It's not possible and it's not effective. But in that home care organizing, I was able to define, what do I actually need? How many people do I actually need to work with to accomplish my goal? So part of it is having that clear goal. And in this case, we want to pass Medicaid expansion legislation. And we want to do so by flipping these 4 specific votes. There are 4 senators, I think it was, that were blocking this legislation that we identified that could be flipped. And really, I just needed between 25 and 50 nurses to show up and have these targeted or needed actions to put pressure on those legislators to flip. So knowing the scope of your campaign, knowing your goal, and how many people that you really need to accomplish that goal. If I have an action where I'm targeting a politician and 8 people show up, that's not really media worthy. But a crowd of 50 can make the news, right? And in labor organizing, there's some math. I mentioned math and music, right? So the math is pretty straightforward. You want 1 leader for every 10 activists. So one for every 10 twos. You want this, say we have 350, you want 10% of your entire campaign to be leaders, right? And then you want to define how much support within that campaign do we need to move forward, or do we consider a majority? And so in Huron Valley was 65%. We need 65% of people to sign this petition and show support before 65% of our 1s and 2s, with 10% on the organizing committee before we think we've got a really strong campaign. Note about that 10% of leaders, you really want that to be representative of your entire community as well, because union busters and our enemies will So Frank Canonica literally would do this. He would go to the Black and brown nurses and say the union's just for the white nurses. And if my organizing committee is just white nurses, that's a believable lie, right? And at the other side of his cheek, he would go to the white nurses and say the union just wants to get, legal citizenship for the immigrant nurses, right? And just really try to tell these lies to divide. But if I don't have members of that community in my leadership team, then those lies are easier to believe.
So true, so true. Thank you, Liz. And I know we're wrapping up here on time. I want to make time for questions. Thank you so much for hanging with us today, going over the 5 core concepts of 1, what is the assessment? 2, well, I don't want to give them all to you. Actually, hashtag today I learned, quick recap for using time-tested tactics to evaluate and boost your organizing campaign. If you're still here and you're still participating, question 3, what are 2 of the 5 core concepts we covered today? So I'm gonna put in Q3, I'm actually using the chat box. So can folks in the chat box add, can you name 2 of the 5 core concepts, don't cheat, we covered today? First one wins a prize.
While we're waiting for that, Seth, I saw another question in the Q&A box from earlier. Do you mind if I read it?
Please, I for some reason I can't get in the Q&A, so let's try to get to as many as we can.
Great. So we have, I'm trying to think through how to implement tracking all this in our CRM so we can enable peer-to-peer leadership outreach. Are there books or printed materials that have these checklists and pipelines? Is there off-the-shelf software that has this already? I use Action Builder. I think that's what you're getting at. I love Action Builder. I think there's a lot of off-the-shelf software. Action Builder is the best. I took the job at the AFL-CIO so I could work on and with this particular tool set that was designed by and for organizers versus all the other tools in the landscape of organizing that was, we've been using. I mean, you can use Excel, you can use pen and paper, but we're using as an organizer, I use so many different tools in the landscape, but I was duct taping it together to try and make it work for my purposes. But at the AFL-CIO, we put a lot of organizers' heads together in partnership with Action Builder, Action Squared, and we continue to do development with organizer input, and it's just, in my opinion, the most seamless tool I've seen out there. Seth, do you have you might have a broader...
Well, I mean, I'm a little biased. I mean, like, Liz helps, she's being very modest. She's on our committee that, as a partner, helps to build the tool. So one of the biggest things with Action Builder is that if you are a partner, then you have say on how it works. We work with only progressive organizations and folks that have actually worked as organizers, so they can tell us what they want in a tool that tracks and assesses folks. But I know folks that use just good old-fashioned, Excel or tools like paper and pencil. Really, that's the only other things that are kind of out there that people use, that, to my knowledge. And it really comes down to what works best for your organization. But I can't, Action Builder works phenomenally for
there's tools like I think Salesforce, Van. Yeah. I did my own Excel with assessments, but yeah, thanks for the question. Hopefully that answers. I'm not familiar with CRM, but if that didn't answer your question, books and printed materials. We could get some resources together if you want to drop your email address in the chat, but there's always, AFL-CIO has an Organizing Institute website that has a lot of resources, actionbuilder.org also, we're seeing in the chat. Great. Yeah, if you want to connect afterwards, we can talk a lot more about these tools.
Right. So yeah, on the screen I've shared actionbuilder.org. If you want to demo the tool anytime, go in there. We demo it once a week on Tuesdays. But if you want a private demo, I'm more than happy to do that as well. And I think they're going to boot us out, but we can try to get to as many questions.
I think that's all the questions in the question box. Anonymous attendee, I hope we answered yours about remote workplaces. Again, my best advice is to, like I said, even remote workplaces workplaces are organized. It's much more isolating. And I do want to say that employers isolate workers from one another intentionally. Even in a hospital, this is true. You know, we couldn't get to the OB nurses because there's literally a locked door. Union busting runs deep in our culture and in our economy. And so this remote work is a little more difficult, more isolating, but people still have to G-chat. You know, how do they actually interact with their coworkers in a remote environment? People have relationships already, so it's about trying to identify those.
Mm-hmm.
And really, you know, working that way, sorry to belabor it, but working that way, you know, it's the workers' campaign. It is not our campaign. You know, there's a phrase in the organizing, I will work as hard as you do, but not harder, right? So you really have to have the natural leaders in the campaign who want it and work for it.
And I see that Jeff in the chat just posted a panel that's talking about organizing remote work. So I see Starbuck wants to participate. I don't know why we just won't let him. We actually have a few more minutes. So, I mean, I just want to, I mean, that's something I've been thinking about with regard to COVID times and how we organize and having those one-on-one conversations. We've seen a lot of groups use peer texting, which is something that you can do through Action Builder or just through any list where you have phone numbers available and people have opted in. Obviously, phone banking is big. I've heard a lot about like folks doing the rallies with vehicles using social distance. So being able to get really creative with how you're engaging and talking with folks, but also keeping safety front and center. But yeah, this is a time where we still needed to use these tactics, which really hinge on creating relationships, knowing how people relate to each other and themselves, and creating that big, vast network. So love input from folks that are thinking about these same issues as we really are working hard to organize for issues that are of concern right now.
And this is going to be open for another 10 minutes. So if there's other questions or comments, we'd be happy to continue to engage as well as we can remotely. I do want to share a couple, going back to the tasks, just brainstorming ideas of tasks you can use. Honestly, it can be as creative as you want and really source ideas from your people and your campaign as well. I only talked about escalating up to delivering a petition, but once you continue, it would be, you know, sign a union card, give a picture and quote, publicly committing to vote for the union and why. This is a big one. If you can push back publicly on your employer, they'll hold these captive audience campaigns and try and tell you union busting lies, why things are so, why you shouldn't vote for a union or whatever your campaign may be. There's always rhetoric coming from the other side, but having someone, a leader or someone respected, stand up and publicly in front of challenge those ideas. And it can be as simple as like, is that true? Right? Just because if it doesn't go unchallenged, then it just gets accepted as truth, right? But that's a pretty high level escalation. It's very scary to do. You can wear buttons, wear swag, you know, all that kind of thing. I've had a mentor say, even if every Thursday everyone rolls their left sleeve up, it shows solidarity. So any kind of visual show of we're all doing something, whatever it is, together at the same time in a coordinated way, it's really powerful and impactful. And then of course we always have the informational pickets, and at the top escalation is always a strike. But be as creative as you want, right? In the chat, it says, my audience is less first-timers and more cynical, know-it-all New Yorkers. How does one shift to different audiences? Gosh, I wish this was interactive. I'd love to ask you follow-up questions about that. Listen, you know, if they're know-it-all, let them tell you what you know. You know, I think I've fallen into this for sure. I've talked to know-it-alls who want to challenge all of my ideas. And I think why is the most powerful question. And studying the Socratic method of questions and leading can be really effective. But you want to get their story, like why are they cynical? Why do they know it all? And yeah, shifting to different audiences. It's really back to the one-on-one conversation, is shedding your preconceived notions about a person and trying to come in with an open mind with the goal of really trying to know who this person is and trying to identify where your shared self-interest is.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. I mean, and then know your people. So it starts with knowing yourself. And that helps you as an organizer be able to relate and find those commonalities. And you know, everyone's not going to have everything in common. I think, you know, most folks know that, just potentially, specifically now, so since we're so, you know, seemingly divided. But just being able to listen to Liz's point and ask those questions to uncover the commonalities, and uncover what they have to say.
I could do a 3-day training just on the one-on-one conversation. So it's a skill, but you can develop it. Oh, and I will say this too, because you said you followed up and so used to hard selling or recruiting. A couple tricks I use is if I fall into that trap, I literally put my hand on my mouth, or literally will bite my tongue on the inside of my mouth if I'm really trying, like getting pulled into that trap. So
yeah. Cool. So thank you so much. I see, do we have any other questions in the chat there? I'm still showing like 3 questions. This is so bizarre. Can you share more about nurturing leaders from Connie? Can you share more about nurturing leaders?
Yes, and I'd be interested if you mean the natural leaders or developing leaders who maybe we're trying to move to a leader. Nurturing leaders. Developing leaders. Okay, meet them where they're at is the key, right? So that conversation with Colleen where she was shaking, I did not give her the hard sell. I was very soft, very quiet, very meeting her where she's at, trying to mirror her communication style, right? There's also a saying, you know, people don't care what you know until they know how much you care, something like that, right? So when I can demonstrate that I care about a person, it engenders trust. And then also it's very important to be trustworthy too, right? So as someone was saying about hard sell and recruiting, you know, having an agenda, we have to, as organizers, have our own integrity and principles, right? And be trustworthy for our community to trust us. And again, just demonstrate that you're willing to be on the front lines with them. Again, I won't work harder than you, but I'll work just as hard. And if you're scared, I will hold your hand. If you are crying, I will give you my shoulder. You know, I will, if you're angry, I will let you yell in my car at 3 a.m., you know, after your shift. So it's just showing up for people. And I mean, kind of part of it is being a friend, right?
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, that is, I want to echo that as far as just having that ability to know that you have their back, because it is, we have to have each other's back because we're in this fight together. We can't let others feel that they're alone, because it is definitely about collective activism. And folks are going to get tired and they're going to get weary, but I know kind of like knowing that someone has your back, because we have a common interest in making our lives better, it can help sustain folks, and then kind of build, again, that network of leaders and folks that are invested.
And organizing is about action, and actions speak louder than words.
So Aldo says, thanks a lot. Jeff
Thank
says,
you, Aldo.
clap, 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 clap.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Well, thank
Liz.
you all for being here. Thank you for engaging. And we hope to see you in person next year, right?
Yes.
We will be around on Zoom until it's safe to be in person.
No doubt. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.